There is one night from the early careers of both Katt Williams and Dave Chappelle that neither of them has ever described in detail in any interview. The people who were at the club that night describe it differently depending on who you ask. But they all agree on one thing. Something passed between those two men on that stage that nobody outside the room ever quite understood. The accounts differ on almost everything else. Some of the people who were there that night say it happened during the sets themselves, a moment on stage, mid-performance, when something shifted in the room in a way that was visible from the audience, even if it was impossible to name. Others say it happened in the minutes between the sets, in the narrow hallway backstage, where two performers who had just occupied the same stage for different reasons briefly occupied the same small space. What nobody who was there disputes is that by the time the evening ended and the club emptied out into a night that had started as an ordinary working night on an ordinary working circuit, something had happened that the room seemed to know mattered, even before anyone could explain why. To understand the shape of what that night could have been, it helps to understand what the comedy circuit looked like in the early 1990s and what it meant to be a young comedian moving through it. The circuit during this period was a network of rooms scattered across the country, clubs in cities large and small, some with names and histories that lent them a certain prestige, most without either. What they shared was a function. They were places where comedians could work, night after night, in front of real audiences with real responses, building the kind of set that no amount of writing alone could build. The circuit was a school that didn't grant degrees, a proving ground that offered no certificates, a place where the only credential that mattered was what happened when you stood at a microphone in front of people who had no particular reason to care about you and made them care anyway. For a young comedian in this era, moving through the circuit meant a specific kind of life. You drove between cities. You slept in cheap hotels or on friends' couches. You performed on weeknights to rooms that were sometimes nearly empty, and on weekends to rooms where the crowd was loud and distracted and took a certain amount of work to earn. You refined the same material through dozens of iterations, finding the words and rhythms that made each bit work, and then you moved on to the next piece of material and started the process over. It was repetitive in a way that could be discouraging, and it was honest in a way that nothing else in the industry was. The room either responded or it didn't. You either worked or you didn't. Dave Chappelle, during this period, was already one of the most talked about young comedians on the circuit, not in the way that would later define him, not yet with the scale of recognition that would come, but in the specific way that circuits talk about performers who are doing something that the people around them don't quite have language for yet. He had started performing very young, had moved to New York while still a teenager, and had developed a voice that other comedians recognized as genuinely unusual, not merely skilled, but operating from a perspective that felt original in the deepest sense. His material was intelligent in ways that didn't announce themselves as intelligence, observational in ways that bent the usual expectations of what observation in comedy was supposed to produce, willing to go toward discomfort rather than away from it. The people who had watched him work during this period spoke about him the way people speak about someone whose career they can already see from where they're standing, even if they can't quite say what it will look like when it arrives. Katt Williams during this same period was in a different place on the same map. He had been building his career through the relentless accumulation of sets in rooms up and down the circuit, developing through repetition and instinct what would eventually become one of the most recognizable voices in American comedy. His path had been less linear than Chappelle's, his early career less centered in the kind of coastal rooms that tended to produce the most industry attention. He had built his following in the middle of the country, in clubs where the crowds were demanding in a specific way, and where the feedback came without any institutional filtration. What he had developed in those rooms was something that the people who saw it recognized immediately and struggled to classify afterward. Not just fast, the speed was real, but it wasn't the thing. Not just sharp, the sharpness was real, but it wasn't the thing either. Something underneath both of those qualities, a way of being completely present with an audience, while simultaneously operating from a private internal logic that made every bit feel like it had come from a place no one else had access to. The night they were on the same bill was a night neither man had particular reason to circle on a calendar. It was a working night, a standard booking, one of dozens each of them would have played that month in rooms that differed from each other in layout and sound quality and the temperature of the crowd, but that all blurred together eventually into the general texture of what the circuit was. The club itself held perhaps 150 people on a full night. By the time the show started, the room was more than half full, enough people to generate real energy, not so many that the performers could disappear into scale. The order had been set in advance by whoever had booked the evening, and nobody who was there that night could later agree on which of them had performed first. It is the kind of detail that in the moment carries no particular weight. The order of a two-person bill at a mid-sized club on a working night is not the sort of thing anyone in the room is tracking consciously. What they track is the sets themselves, and the sets, by all accounts, were both extraordinary in ways that the room registered before anyone in it fully understood what they were watching. What the accounts do agree on, the one thing that holds constant across the different versions of the evening that the people there have told in different ways over the years, is what happened in the minutes after both sets were done. The room was still processing something. The audience had not simply laughed and moved on in the way audiences usually move on from a good set. They had been given something that sat with them in a way that ordinary sets didn't, and the room had the particular energy of people who are still in the presence of something they haven't finished experiencing. Backstage, in the narrow space behind the stage that such clubs designate as a green room, with a generosity that the space rarely earns, both men were present at the same time. The accounts diverged sharply on what, if anything, was said. Some of the people who were nearby, a stage manager, a comedian who had stopped in to watch, have described a conversation. Others have said there was almost no conversation at all, that the two men occupied the same small space for several minutes and said very little, and that what made those minutes memorable was precisely that absence. Two people who had each just done something extraordinary in the same room, standing near each other, finding that there wasn't much that needed to be said about it. What none of the accounts dispute is the quality of the silence, if silence is the right word for it. Not an uncomfortable silence, not the silence of two strangers with nothing to say to each other. Something else. The silence of mutual recognition, the specific quiet that settles between two people who have each just seen the other do something that they understood from the inside, in a way that required no translation and no explanation and no words to confirm. A silence that was, in its own way, a complete conversation. Neither Katt Williams nor Dave Chappelle has ever discussed that night in any interview in any detail. There are no accounts from either man of what the evening meant to them, or what they thought of each other's work. In the decades since, as both careers grew into things that the working night at that small club would have given no reason to predict, the silence around that particular evening has remained unbroken by either person who was at its center. That silence is itself a kind of answer, though to what question is difficult to say exactly. What the night tells us about both men is something that their later careers confirm from different angles. Dave Chappelle went on to build a body of work defined, above almost anything else, by an unwillingness to perform for an audience's convenience, a commitment to saying what he actually saw about the world, in the language it actually demanded, regardless of whether that made the resulting work easy or comfortable or classifiable. Katt Williams went on to build a body of work defined by a similar commitment, to a voice so specific and a perspective so entirely his own, that audiences who encountered it for the first time often described the experience as discovering something they hadn't known they were missing. Two voices that uncompromising, in the same room, on the same night, before either of them had the career that would make them impossible to ignore. What passed between them in that green room was the recognition that each of them understood the other's work from the inside. Not as fans, not as admirers, as people who were doing versions of the same rare and difficult thing, and who recognized in each other, without needing to say so, that the difficulty of it was real, and that neither of them was going to stop doing it. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the specials, not the television, not any of the work that came after and made both names into things that audiences everywhere recognized. One small club, one working night, two voices that the world hadn't found yet, and the quiet that settled between them in a narrow backstage hallway when the sets were done and there was nothing left to prove to anyone.